There are silences in your life that are not empty. They are not voids or absences, but structures. They are rooms you build with another person, rooms with invisible walls and unspoken rules, furnished with everything you are too afraid to say aloud. For months, Julian and I had been building such a room, and its architecture was the narrow space of my military-issue bunk. Its foundation was the shared, unbreathing quiet of the barracks after midnight, and its ceiling was the heavy, woolen blanket of everything we did not know how to be to one another. The most important rule of this place we had constructed was that we never, ever spoke of its existence. We were simply two soldiers, sharing a bunk on cold nights. A practical arrangement, a matter of convenience. A lie we had both tacitly agreed to live inside, because the truth was a far more fragile and terrifying thing to build. But one night, the silence changed. It stopped being a room and became a doorway. I felt the shift in the air before I felt it in the mattress. Julian, who had slipped into my bunk an hour earlier with the practiced stealth of a shadow, was not asleep. I knew the rhythm of his sleep like my own, the slow, steady tide of his breath, the occasional twitch of a muscle in his back as he settled deeper into a dream. This was different. This was a stillness born of tension, a quiet that was listening. I lay on my side, facing the cold metal wall, my own breathing a shallow, controlled thing. I could feel the heat of him pressed along the entire length of my back, a familiar comfort that had become the most profound and destabilizing force in my life. For 83 nights, he had come to my bunk. 83 nights where he would wait until the last cough had echoed through the long room, until the only sound was the hum of the generator and the sigh of the wind against the window panes. He would slide from his own bunk across the aisle, his bare feet silent on the cold linoleum, and climb the short ladder to mine. He would settle behind me, a solid, warm weight that chased away the ever-present chill of the Alaskan air base, and within minutes, he would be asleep. And I would lie awake for hours, cataloging the feeling of it, terrified of moving, terrified of breathing too loudly, terrified that this fragile, impossible ritual would be the last. But tonight, he was awake. I could feel the coiled energy in him, the subtle tension in the arm that was draped loosely over my side. The silence stretched, growing thin and sharp. It was no longer a comfortable blanket. It was a wire pulled taut between us, humming with a frequency I could feel in my teeth. Then, his voice, a whisper so quiet it seemed to be a part of the silence itself, not a break in it. "Leo." My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone. It was the first time he had ever spoken, the first time either of us had acknowledged the other's wakefulness in this space. I didn't answer immediately. I was trying to build a response from the scattered dust of my composure, trying to make my voice sound sleepy, casual, undisturbed. The lie felt heavy and clumsy on my tongue. "Yeah." I finally managed, my own voice a rough and used thing. Another long pause. I felt him shift slightly behind me, the warmth of his breath ghosting over the back of my neck. I could feel the question he wanted to ask forming in the space between us. It was a physical thing, a pressure building in the air. This was it. The moment the walls of our silent room would either be reinforced into a fortress or come crashing down around us. The wire pulled tighter. He inhaled, a small, sharp sound. And I knew, with a certainty that was both terrifying and electrifying, that whatever he said next would change the geography of my entire world. The foundation was about to crack. The silence was about to break. And I had no idea if we would be left standing in the ruins or finally standing on solid ground. I had known Julian for 2 years, but in the compressed, hermetically sealed world of military life, 2 years felt like a lifetime. We met in the humid chaos of basic training, two anonymous faces in a sea of shaved heads and ill-fitting fatigues. He was everything I was not. Julian moved through the world with an easy, unthinking grace, a casual confidence that drew people to him like moths to a porch light. He made friends effortlessly, laughed loudly, and carried the grueling physical demands of our training with a shrug, as if it were all just an elaborate, slightly tedious game. I was the opposite. I was a quiet observer, a watcher from the periphery. I had learned early in life that the safest place to be was in the background, a student of shadows and subtle gestures. My camera was my native language, a way to frame the world and interact with it from a safe distance. In the loud, aggressive, performative masculinity of basic training, I felt like a visitor from another planet. I was competent, I followed orders, I did what was required, but I was fundamentally separate. Julian was the one who bridged that distance. I remember the exact moment. We were on a long, punishing ruck march, the Georgia sun beating down on us with a physical weight. I had fallen a few paces behind, my focus narrowed to the scuffed boots of the man in front of me, my mind a blank slate of exhaustion. Suddenly, Julian was beside me, having dropped back from his position near the front of the platoon. He didn't say much. He just fell into step with me, his presence a solid, reassuring anchor. He started talking about his dog, a goofy golden retriever named Gus, describing in hilarious detail how the dog would try to help with yard work by stealing gardening gloves. He wasn't trying to motivate me or give me a pep talk. He was just talking, filling the suffocating silence with a story from home, from a world outside the fence. He was, without making a show of it, sharing his load. From that day on, an invisible thread connected us. He would save me a seat in the mess hall. He would toss a clean pair of socks onto my bunk when he saw mine were soaked through. He didn't try to change me or pull me into the boisterous center of his social circle. He simply made a space for me at its edge, a space that felt protected and, for the first time, welcome. My feelings for him grew so slowly and quietly that I almost didn't notice them taking root. It wasn't a lightning strike, a sudden, cinematic revelation. It was more like the slow, patient process of developing a photograph in a darkroom. At first, there was just an outline, the vague shape of a deep and abiding friendship. We were assigned to the same unit after basic, sent to a remote outpost in Alaska where the world shrank to the size of our barracks and the vast, indifferent wilderness that surrounded it. Our friendship deepened in that isolation. We learned each other's habits, the subtle shifts in mood that no one else saw. I knew that the slight tightening around his eyes meant he was worried about his mother's health. He knew that when I retreated into silence and cleaned my camera lenses for the third time in a day, I was feeling overwhelmed by the sheer, crushing proximity of our lives. He was the only person who didn't try to fill my silences with noise, who seemed to understand that they were a necessary part of my landscape. The image began to resolve, the details coming into focus. I realized I was watching him more than I was watching anyone else. I'd find my gaze lingering on the way his brow furrowed in concentration when he was cleaning his rifle, or the easy, unself-conscious way he'd stretch in the morning, his t-shirt riding up to reveal the sharp line of his hip. I started to notice the sound of his laugh in a crowded room, a specific frequency my ears were tuned to pick out from the general cacophony. These were small things, tiny silver halide crystals aligning on the photographic paper of my heart. The final image, the one that left me breathless and undeniable in the dim red light of my own secret awareness, developed one evening in the common room. He was on the phone with his girlfriend back home, a girl named Sarah whom I'd never met, but whose picture sat on his nightstand. He was leaning against the wall, the phone pressed to his ear, his face illuminated by the flickering light of the television. He wasn't saying much, just a series of ahas and yeah, I knows. There was a profound weariness in his posture, a loneliness in his eyes that the forced cheerfulness in his voice couldn't hide. He looked disconnected, like he was performing a role he had long since forgotten the lines for. And as I watched him, a wave of something fierce and protective washed over me. It was more than friendship. It was a deep, aching desire to bridge the distance I saw in his eyes, to be the person on the other end of the line who understood the weight of his silences. It was love. The image was fully formed, sharp and clear and terrifying. I pushed it down, hid it away in the darkest room of my mind, and locked the door. He was my best friend. He had a girlfriend. We were soldiers on a remote base. The list of reasons why this feeling was impossible, dangerous, and self-destructive was a mile long. So I became a better photographer, a more practiced observer. I learned to live with the quiet ache of it, to treat it as a chronic condition, a part of my internal weather system. I was the keeper of a secret, and the weight of it was mine alone to bear. The shift began in autumn, as the brief, explosive Alaskan summer gave way to a long, drawn-out twilight. The first snows had dusted the mountains, and the air carried a new, sharper edge. The change wasn't in me. I was a constant, a fixed point of quiet longing. The change was in Julian. It started with a letter. Mail call was a ritual, a brief, twice-weekly connection to the world we had left behind. Julian always got letters from Sarah, pale blue envelopes in a neat, looping script. But one Tuesday, the envelope was different. It was thicker, a standard business envelope with his name and address typed out. He took it without comment, his expression unreadable, and tucked it into the pocket of his fatigues. He didn't open it until that night, after lights out, sitting on the edge of his bunk with only the thin beam of a small flashlight for illumination. I pretended to be asleep, watching him through slitted eyes from across the aisle. I saw the way his shoulders tensed as he read, the way his jaw tightened. He read the pages once, then twice. Then he carefully folded them, put them back in the envelope, and slid it under his pillow. He lay down and pulled the covers up to his chin, facing the wall. He didn't move for the rest of the night. He never mentioned the letter. He never said the name Sarah again. The photograph on his nightstand disappeared the next day. It wasn't a dramatic, heart-wrenching breakup, at least not outwardly. There was no shouting, no tears, no desperate phone calls. It was an implosion, a quiet, catastrophic collapse that happened entirely on the inside. Julian, the easygoing, confident center of our small universe, began to fray at the edges. The change was subtle at first. He was quieter. He stopped instigating the late-night card games or organizing movie nights in the common room. His easy laugh, the sound that had always been a kind of ambient music in our barracks, became a rare and precious commodity. He still did his job, still performed his duties with the same competence as always. He was a good soldier, but the light in him had dimmed. It was as if someone had turned down the wattage of his soul, leaving him moving through the world in a perpetual state of twilight. He started to look haunted. There were dark circles under his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights. He'd stare off into the middle distance during meals, his fork hovering over his food, lost in a landscape only he could see. The oppressive routine of the base, which usually provided a comforting structure, now seemed to be a cage. Each repeated action, the morning reveille, the drills, the inspections, another bar reinforcing his isolation. I tried to reach him in my own quiet way. I'd ask if he wanted to go for a run, or if he wanted to borrow a book. I'd bring him back a hot chocolate from the mess hall on a particularly cold night. He would always accept with a small, grateful smile, but it never seemed to penetrate the fog that had settled around him. He was polite, appreciative, but distant. He had retreated into a fortress of his own making, and I didn't have the words to ask for the gate to be lowered. The loneliness became a third roommate in our small, shared space. It was a physical presence, a cold draft that seemed to emanate from his side of the room. I could feel it when I was reading on my bunk, a palpable weight in the air. I could feel it when we were brushing our teeth side by side at the sinks, a chasm of silence between us that felt miles wide. I missed my friend. I missed the easy camaraderie, the shared jokes, the comfortable silence that had once existed between us. This new silence was different. It was jagged and cold, filled with all the things he couldn't say and all the things I was too afraid to ask. And then came the first night. It was late October. A storm had blown in from the north, rattling the windows and driving sheets of icy rain against the building. The heating in our barracks was notoriously unreliable, and a deep, penetrating cold had settled into the bones of the building. I was huddled in my bunk, layered in sweats and buried under 2 blankets, reading by the dim light of my headlamp. The barracks were quiet except for the howl of the wind and the chorus of snores from the other men. It was well after midnight when I heard it, the faint creak of springs from across the aisle. I turned off my light, my heart giving a strange, sudden lurch. I lay in the darkness, listening. I heard the whisper of bare feet on the floor, a sound I wouldn't have noticed if I hadn't been so attuned to the room's nocturnal symphony. Then, the softest scrape of a foot on the ladder to my bunk. My breath caught in my throat. My mind raced, trying to find a logical explanation. Was he sick? Did he need something? The mattress dipped behind me. I felt a wave of cold air as he lifted the edge of my blankets, and then a wave of warmth as he slid in behind me. He was careful, almost reverent in his movements, trying not to jostle me. He settled on his side, his back to mine, a clear foot of space between us. He pulled the blanket over his shoulder, and then he was perfectly still. I lay there, my body rigid, my mind a riot of confusion and a wild, terrifying hope. What was happening? What did this mean? I listened to the sound of his breathing, waiting for it to even out into the rhythm of sleep, but it remained shallow, wakeful. We lay like that for what felt like an eternity, back to back, two silent, motionless figures in the dark, the storm raging outside and a different, more turbulent storm raging inside the small confines of my bed. I was acutely aware of every inch of the space between us. It felt charged, electric. Finally, his breathing began to deepen. The tension in his body seemed to dissolve, and I felt the mattress shift slightly as he relaxed into sleep. Only then did I allow myself to breathe, a long, slow exhale that I felt like I had been holding for an hour. I didn't sleep at all that night. I stayed awake, a sentinel in the dark, guarding this strange, fragile truce. I was terrified of moving, of breaking the spell. In the gray, pre-dawn light, just before the first notes of reveille would shatter the morning, I felt him stir. He slipped out of the bunk as silently as he had arrived, and by the time the lights flickered on, he was back in his own bed, the picture of perfect normalcy. We didn't speak of it. We went through our morning routine, our movements synchronized by long habit, and not a single glance or gesture passed between us to acknowledge that anything had changed. But everything had. The architecture of our friendship had been fundamentally altered. A door had been opened, and I had no idea where it led. The first night became a ritual. It wasn't every night, not at first. It was sporadic, unpredictable, governed by a logic I couldn't decipher. It seemed to happen on the coldest nights, or on nights when the weight of the day had pressed down on him with particular force. But gradually, it became more frequent. 3 nights a week, then 4. Soon, it was more unusual for him to spend the entire night in his own bunk than in mine. We never spoke of it. The daylight hours were a carefully constructed stage play of platonic friendship. We were Leo and Julian, bunkmates, brothers in arms. We talked about training exercises, complained about the food in the mess hall, and planned what we would do on our next weekend pass. But when the lights went out, the play ended, and the silent, secret world of my bunk became our reality. I became a scholar of this new reality, an obsessive chronicler of its nuances. My senses, already heightened by my photographer's eye, became almost painfully acute. I learned to distinguish the sound of his footsteps from all the others in the barracks. I knew the exact moment the ambient noise of a dozen sleeping men would swallow the sound of him climbing the ladder, providing the perfect cover for his arrival. He always came to me in the same way, sliding in behind me, a silent, warm presence. At first, he maintained a careful distance, a sliver of cold air between our backs, as if to preserve the fiction that this was merely about sharing warmth. But as the weeks went on, the space between us began to shrink. It happened in increments so small they were almost imperceptible. A night where his knee brushed against the back of mine. A night where, in his sleep, his hand came to rest on the mattress inches from my own. Each tiny, accidental point of contact sent a jolt through my system, a silent explosion of feeling that I had to carefully contain. My bunk became a laboratory for the study of proximity. I was hyper-aware of the heat radiating from his body, a palpable energy that seemed to soak into my very bones. I could smell the faint, clean scent of the soap he used, a scent that I began to associate with a feeling of profound, terrifying peace. I learned the topography of his sleeping form, the curve of his spine, the broad plane of his shoulders. Lying there in the dark, I felt like a cartographer mapping a new and uncharted continent, a land of impossible beauty and incredible danger. My internal world was a constant, roiling debate. One part of me, The hopeful, romantic part one had tried so hard to suppress, saw this ritual as a confession. It saw his silent approach as a declaration of a need he couldn't voice, a subconscious admission of a feeling that mirrored my own. This part of me lived for the nights he came to my bunk, hoarding the memory of his warmth like a dragon hoarding gold. It was a sweet, intoxicating poison that made the long, lonely days bearable. But another part of me, the pragmatic, self-protective part, was terrified. This part insisted that I was projecting, that I was building a palace of meaning on a foundation of simple, platonic need. He was lonely. He was cold. He was grieving a lost relationship. I was his best friend, a source of comfort, a human hot water bottle. To assign any deeper meaning to it was to set myself up for a devastating fall. This part of me warned me, night after night, not to move, not to speak, not to do anything that could be misinterpreted. It told me to accept this strange gift for what it was and not to ask for more, because asking would be the thing that made it all disappear. This internal war left me exhausted. During the day, I moved through my duties in a haze, my mind constantly replaying the events of the previous night, analyzing every shift in weight, every sigh, every rustle of the blankets. My photography became my only outlet, the only place I could process the overwhelming influx of feeling. I stopped taking pictures of the grand, sweeping Alaskan landscapes. Instead, I turned my lens inward, focusing on the small, intimate details of our life on the base. I took pictures of the space between our bunks, of the worn patch on the floor where his feet landed every morning, of his jacket hanging on a hook next to mine, the sleeves just barely touching. I was trying to capture the unbearable tension of our unspoken relationship, the beauty and the ache of the space between us. My photographs were filled with shadows and light, with boundaries and the places where they blurred. They were portraits of a silence, attempts to document the architecture of the invisible room we inhabited every night. Then came the night the geography of that room shifted permanently. The space between us, which had been slowly shrinking over the months, vanished entirely. He had slipped into my bunk as usual, but instead of settling with his back to me, he hesitated. I felt him hover for a moment, and then, with a slow, deliberate movement, he turned onto his other side, so that he was facing my back. The air crackled. This was new. This was a deviation from the script. He settled in, his chest now pressed against my shoulder blades, the soft puff of his breath warming the back of my neck. My entire body went rigid. I was so close I could feel the steady, rhythmic beat of his heart against my back. It was a slow, powerful drumbeat that seemed to be calling to something deep inside me. He shifted again, a small adjustment, and his arm came around my waist, his hand resting lightly on my hip. It was not the clumsy, accidental touch of a sleeping man. It was a placement. It was intentional. It was a question asked without words. I lay there, scarcely breathing, my mind a blank slate of pure sensation. The weight of his arm was both an unbearable pressure and the most profound relief I had ever known. It was an anchor in the storm of my own anxiety. For all my analysis, for all my frantic internal monologue, I had no idea how to respond. The hope and the terror were no longer at war. They had fused into a single, overwhelming emotion that had no name. I could feel the tension in his body, the subtle rigidity that told me he was as awake and as aware as I was. He was waiting. He was waiting for me to pull away, to shift, to do something that would signal my rejection and allow us both to retreat to the safety of plausible deniability. And in that moment, I made a choice. I didn't pull away. I didn't move a muscle. Instead, I let my own body relax, just a fraction, a subtle softening that was its own kind of answer. I leaned back into him, a movement of millimeters that felt like a journey of 1,000 miles. I felt the tension drain out of him in a long, slow sigh. His arm tightened around me, pulling me closer until there was no space left between us at all. He rested his forehead between my shoulder blades, and we lay there, tangled together in the dark, two soldiers in a narrow bunk, finally inhabiting the same small piece of the world. He fell asleep like that, his breathing a warm tide against my back. But I stayed awake until morning, guarding the silence, which was no longer empty, but full to bursting with a fragile, terrifying, and beautiful new thing. The ritual now had a new shape. The pretense of accidental proximity was gone, replaced by an intentional, deliberate closeness. Every night, he would come to my bunk, and every night, he would wrap himself around me, his body a warm, protective shield against the cold and the dark. We were two halves of a whole, fitted together in the narrow space, our limbs entwined, our breathing synchronized. It was a state of grace so profound it felt illicit, a stolen treasure that I was sure would be snatched away at any moment. The days remained our stage play, but the performances were becoming strained. The unspoken intimacy of the nights bled into the daylight hours, creating a new layer of tension between us. I would catch him looking at me from across the mess hall, his gaze intense and unreadable, and he would quickly look away when our eyes met. A casual touch, his hand brushing mine as we reached for the same tool, his shoulder bumping against mine in a crowded hallway, would send a jolt of electricity between us that felt anything but casual. We were orbiting each other, held in place by a powerful, invisible gravity, and I could feel the trajectory starting to decay. We were spiraling inward, closer and closer to an inevitable collision. The collision came on a Saturday night in late winter. A blizzard had descended on the base, cutting us off from the outside world. The wind screamed like a banshee, and snow piled in huge drifts against the buildings. We were confined to the barracks, a restless energy humming through the room as men grew bored and agitated. Julian was particularly quiet all day, a deep, melancholic mood having settled over him. He spent most of the afternoon staring out the window at the swirling white chaos, his expression bleak. That night, he came to my bunk earlier than usual. The lights were still on in the common room, the sound of a movie and sporadic laughter drifting down the hall. He didn't wait for the deep quiet of midnight. He climbed the ladder and slipped under the covers, his body cold from the drafty air. He settled behind me, pulling me close, but there was a frantic energy in his touch, a desperation that hadn't been there before. His arms were tight around me, his face buried in my shoulder. I could feel a faint tremor running through his body. We lay in silence, listening to the storm outside and the storm inside him. The silence between us, which had been a space of comfort and unspoken understanding, now felt heavy with words that were being held back by a crumbling dam. He was the one who broke it. Leo. His voice was muffled by my shirt, a low, rough sound. It was only the second time he had ever spoken in this space. Yeah, I whispered, my heart beginning to pound its familiar, frantic rhythm. He was silent for a long time, so long that I started to think he had changed his mind. I could feel the frantic beating of his heart against my back. The wind howled, rattling the window frame in its casement. Then, he shifted, pulling back just enough to look at me. I felt the movement, and, after a moment's hesitation, I turned over to face him. In the dim, ambient light filtering in from the hallway, I could just make out the shape of his face. His eyes were wide, dark pools of uncertainty. We were inches apart, the air between us thick and heavy. His hand, which had been resting on my waist, moved up to cup my cheek. His thumb stroked my skin, a touch so tender and tentative it almost broke me. His expression was one of profound, searching vulnerability. He looked like a man standing at the edge of a cliff, trying to decide if he should jump. Would it be okay? He whispered, his voice cracking on the last word. He didn't need to finish the sentence. I knew what he was asking. The question hung in the air between us, a fragile, shimmering thing. It was an offering of his own terror, his own confusion, his own desperate need. He was giving me the choice. He was giving me the power to save us both from this precipice, to let us retreat to the safety of our silent ritual. All I had to do was say no. All I had to do was turn away. But looking into his eyes, seeing the raw, unguarded honesty there, I knew I couldn't. We had been building to this moment for months, laying each brick of silence and stolen touch with meticulous care. This was the keystone. I didn't answer with words. I simply leaned forward, closing the last inch of space between us. His lips were cool, chapped from the winter air. The kiss wasn't passionate or demanding. It was a question, a discovery. It was hesitant, gentle, and achingly soft. It was the taste of loneliness and the hope of an antidote. It was the sound of the dam breaking, of months of unspoken feeling pouring out into a single, quiet point of contact. He made a small sound in the back of his throat, a sigh of relief or surrender, and his hand tightened on my cheek, holding me there as if he were afraid I might disappear. The kiss deepened, but it never lost its quality of reverent discovery. It was a conversation we were having in a language we were both just learning to speak. It was a confession. It was an absolution. And in the heart of the screaming blizzard, in the quiet darkness of my narrow bunk, the world fell away, and there was only this. There was only us. The morning after was a wasteland of silence. I woke slowly, coming up from a deep, dreamless sleep, the memory of the kiss a warm, glowing ember in my chest. But the space beside me was cold. Julian was gone. I sat up, my heart sinking. His own bunk across the aisle was empty, the blankets thrown back in a haphazard way. A quick glance around the barracks showed that he wasn't there. I got dressed, a knot of dread tightening in my stomach. The blizzard had broken, and a weak, watery sunlight was filtering through the windows, glinting off a world buried in white. The pristine, untouched snow felt like a mockery. I found him in the mess hall, sitting alone at a table in the corner, nursing a cup of coffee. He was staring out the window, his shoulders hunched. I walked over, my boots echoing in the nearly empty room. "Hey," I said softly. He started, as if I had woken him from a trance. He looked up at me, and his eyes were guarded, distant. The open, vulnerable man from the night before was gone, replaced by a stranger wearing his face. "Morning," he said, his voice flat. He looked back out the window. I sat down opposite him, the silence between us as vast and as cold as the snow-covered landscape outside. I searched for something to say, something to bridge this sudden, terrifying chasm. But all my words felt like stones that would only sink without a trace. We sat like that for 5 minutes, the silence screaming. Finally, he pushed his chair back and stood up. "I've got duty," he said, not looking at me. And then he walked away. That was the beginning of the Great Retreat. Julian pulled away from me with a speed and totality that left me reeling. He became a ghost. He was polite, professional, and utterly remote. He spoke to me only when necessary, his answers clipped and impersonal. He avoided being alone with me, orchestrating his schedule so our paths rarely crossed outside of official duties. He started spending his evenings in the common room, surrounding himself with other people, a human shield against the intimacy we had shared. And he stopped coming to my bunk. The nights were the worst. I would lie awake in the crushing silence, staring at his empty bed across the aisle, the space beside me a cold, aching void. The warmth I had grown so accustomed to was gone, and the Alaskan chill seemed to seep directly into my soul. I felt a fool. I had misinterpreted everything. The months of intimacy, the desperate confession in his eyes, the kiss that had felt so real. I had built it all up in my own head. For him, it had been a moment of weakness, a drunken impulse without the alcohol, a mistake he was now trying desperately to erase. The shame was a physical thing, a sour taste in the back of my throat. I had allowed myself to hope, and the universe had punished me for it. This went on for a week. A week of polite nods in hallways. A week of eating meals at opposite ends of the mess hall. A week of cold, empty nights. The pain of it was a constant, low-grade fever, but beneath the pain, something else was beginning to grow. Anger. I was angry at him for his cowardice, for pretending that the most honest moment we had ever shared had never happened. And I was angry at myself for letting him do it, for my own passive acceptance of this new, miserable status quo. I had spent my whole life observing from the sidelines, afraid to step into the frame. I had watched my own life unfold from a safe distance. But I couldn't do it anymore. The silence he had created was not the comfortable, sacred silence of my bunk. It was a weapon, and he was using it to cut me out of his life. I refused to be a ghost in my own story. I cornered him 2 days later. I saw him heading toward the supply depot, and I knew it was one of the few places on base we could be guaranteed a few moments of privacy. I followed him, my heart hammering against my ribs, a cocktail of fear and resolve coursing through my veins. He was in one of the back storerooms, counting inventory on a clipboard. He looked up when I entered, his eyes widening in alarm. He immediately tried to brush past me. "Excuse me, I've got to." I stepped in front of him, blocking the door. "No," I said, my voice steadier than I expected. "We're going to talk." He wouldn't meet my eyes. He stared at a point on the wall just over my shoulder. "There's nothing to talk about, Leo, nothing to talk about?" The anger finally broke through, hot and sharp. "For 3 months, you slept in my bed. You held me like I was the only solid thing in the world. You kissed me, and now you're telling me there's nothing to talk about? Look at me, Julian." He flinched, but he finally, reluctantly, met my gaze. His face was a mask of misery. I saw the fear in his eyes, but I also saw the deep, familiar sadness that had been his constant companion for months. Seeing it softened my anger, just a little. "What do you want me to say?" he whispered, his voice hoarse. "I want you to tell me the truth," I said, my own voice dropping. "Just tell me the truth. If it was a mistake, just say it. If you regret it, just tell me. I can take it. But what I can't take is this. I can't take you pretending I don't exist. I can't take you looking through me like I'm a stranger. After everything, I deserve more than that. We deserve more than that." His composure finally cracked. His face crumpled, and he leaned his forehead against a tall metal shelving unit, his shoulders shaking. He didn't make a sound, but I could feel the waves of anguish coming off him. I waited, giving him the space to collect himself. After a long moment, he took a shuddering breath and straightened up, wiping at his eyes with the back of his hand. "It wasn't a mistake," he said, his voice thick with unshed tears. He still wasn't looking at me, but at the concrete floor. "That's the problem. It wasn't a mistake." He finally looked up, and his eyes were swimming with a confusion so profound it made my heart ache. "I don't know what's happening, Leo. I don't feel this way. About guys. I had a girlfriend. I was supposed to marry her. This isn't who I am, who you thought you were." "You mean?" I said gently. "I lie awake at night," he continued, his voice tumbling out in a rushed, desperate confession, "and all I can think about is how safe I felt. In your bunk. All the noise in my head, all the crap, it just went away. And I've never felt that with anyone. Not even with her. And it scares the hell out of me. Because it felt more real than anything I've ever known. And I don't know what to do with that. I don't know what it means." He finally ran out of words, his chest heaving, his gaze fixed on me, pleading for an answer I didn't have. He was terrified. He was lost. And in his confession, I finally understood. His retreat wasn't about me. It wasn't a rejection. It was a flight from a truth about himself that was so large and so destabilizing it threatened to shatter his entire world. He hadn't been running from me. He had been running from himself. I stepped closer to him, closing the space he had so carefully maintained for the past week. He didn't back away. I reached out, my hand hovering for a second before I rested it gently on his arm. He flinched at the contact, but he didn't pull away. I could feel the trembling in his muscles beneath his sleeve. I looked at this man, my friend, the person I knew better than anyone else on this earth, and saw him not as a source of my pain, but as someone in a profound state of it. My own hurt and anger dissolved, replaced by the same fierce, protective wave I had felt all those months ago in the common room. He was a cartographer staring at a map of his own soul, terrified because it was not the country he thought he had been living in. "You don't have to know what it means right now," I said, my voice quiet but firm. "You don't have to have a label for it. You don't have to redefine your entire existence today, in this storeroom. All you have to do is stop running from it." I paused, letting the words sink in. "And stop running from me." I looked directly into his eyes, trying to pour all the patience and certainty I could muster into my gaze. "I'm not confused, Julian. This isn't new for me. I'm not scared of it." I took a breath, the next words feeling like they were being pulled from the deepest part of my being. "I've been in love with you for a year. So whatever this is, whatever you're feeling, you're not in it alone. You've never been in it alone." The confession hung in the air between us, a stark and undeniable truth. His eyes widened, a storm of emotions passing over his face. Shock, disbelief, and then, slowly, a dawning, heartbreaking flicker of relief. The fight seemed to go out of him, the rigid posture of his fear and denial finally collapsing. He sagged against the shelves, his head tipping back with a weary sigh. He was looking at the ceiling, but I knew he wasn't seeing it. He was seeing the last year, the last few months, through a new lens. He was re-examining every shared silence, every casual touch, every night spent in my bunk, and seeing them for what they were. "You never said anything," he whispered, his voice filled with wonder. A small, sad smile touched my lips. "You had a girlfriend. You're my best friend. I was content to be your friend. That was enough. I never would have said anything if you hadn't. If I hadn't started climbing into your bed every night like a lost kid," he finished, a note of self-recrimination in his voice. He finally looked at me again, his expression raw and open. "God, Leo, I'm so sorry. For this last week. I've been such an idiot. I was just so terrified. It felt like I was standing on the edge of something, and if I took one more step, I'd fall and never stop falling. Maybe we fall together," I said softly. He searched my face, looking for something. Reassurance, certainty, a map for this new territory. I just held his gaze, trying to be a steady anchor in his sea of confusion. We didn't need to solve everything right now. We didn't need a 5-year plan or a declaration for the history books. We just needed to take the next step. For him, the next step was to stop running. For me, it was to be patient enough to wait for him. "Okay," he breathed out, the word a puff of steam in the cold air of the storeroom. It was not a grand proclamation. It was not a promise of forever. It was just one word. But it was enough. It was a beginning. It was the first step back from the edge. He reached out, and his fingers brushed against mine, a hesitant, questioning touch. I turned my hand over and laced my fingers through his. His hand was cold, but it warmed quickly in mine. We stood there for a long time, in the quiet storeroom, surrounded by shelves of neatly organized supplies, holding hands like two teenagers, the silence between us no longer a weapon or a void, but a space for healing. It was a new kind of silence, a foundation we could start to build on, together, this time with our eyes wide open. The new normal began that night. There was no grand discussion, no negotiation of terms. After lights out, as the barracks settled into its familiar rhythm of coughs and murmurs, I lay in my bunk, my heart a nervous, fluttering thing. I didn't know what to expect. I had laid my cards on the table, and he had taken the first, tentative step towards me, but the space between our bunks still felt like a mile-wide canyon. I waited, listening. An hour passed, then another. I had almost resigned myself to the idea that things would take more time, that the storeroom had been a beginning but not a solution, when I heard it. The soft, familiar creak of his bunk. My breath hitched. He padded across the floor, climbed the ladder, and slid under the covers. But this time was different from all the hundreds of nights that had come before. He didn't settle behind me. He came around to face me, his body arranged carefully in the narrow space. He reached for my hand in the darkness, his fingers finding mine and linking them together on the mattress between us. "Hey," he whispered. "Hey," I whispered back. And that was all. He didn't wrap himself around me. He didn't kiss me. We just lay there, face to face in the dim light, holding hands, our linked fingers a bridge across all the fear and confusion. It was a deliberate act of connection and acknowledgement. The plausible deniability was gone forever. This was not about warmth or nightmares or loneliness. This was about us. He fell asleep first, his face relaxed and peaceful in a way I hadn't seen in months. I stayed awake, watching him, the feeling of his hand in mine the most real and solid thing in the universe. The invisible room we had once built out of silence and fear was gone. In its place, we were beginning to build something new. A home. The days that followed were a quiet revelation. The change in Julian was profound. The haunted, hollowed-out look in his eyes was replaced by a soft, steady light. He started smiling again, a genuine, easy smile that reached his eyes. His laughter, once a rarity, returned to the ambient soundtrack of our lives. It was as if a great, crushing weight had been lifted from his shoulders, and in its place was a quiet sense of purpose. Our public interactions changed, too. We were still discreet. We had to be, in that environment. But the strained, careful distance was gone. He would seek me out in the mess hall, sitting beside me without hesitation. He would walk in step with me, his shoulder brushing against mine, a casual, constant point of contact. He started talking again, really talking, sharing the small details of his day, asking about my photography, rebuilding the easy camaraderie we had lost. To anyone watching, we were just two best friends who had gotten over a rough patch. But to me, every shared glance, every inside joke, every quiet moment of understanding was a testament to the new truth between us. Our nights became our sanctuary. The ritual evolved. We would talk for hours in low whispers, sharing stories from our childhoods, our fears about the future, our dreams for a life beyond the confines of the base. It was in the dark, in the safety of my bunk, that he slowly, carefully explored the new landscape of his own heart. He would ask me questions, tentative and searching. When did I know? Was I ever scared? He was mapping himself, using me as his compass. And I just answered honestly, giving him the space to be confused and uncertain, never pushing for more than he was ready to give. The physical intimacy grew naturally from that emotional honesty. It started with holding hands. Then he would rest his head on my chest, listening to the beat of my heart. There were soft, sleepy kisses, gentle and reassuring, affirmations of the bond we were forging. It wasn't about passion, it was about peace. It was about creating a space where two people could be completely, utterly themselves, without judgment or fear. It was about finding a home in another person. One afternoon, I was cleaning my camera lenses on my bunk, the late winter sun slanting through the window. Julian came and sat on the edge of the mattress, watching me. He picked up one of my recent photos, a black and white print of the empty space between our bunks, the light from the window creating a stark, beautiful line on the floor. "What were you trying to capture here?" he asked, his voice soft. I looked at the photo, at the empty space that had once been so full of longing and tension. I said slowly. I was trying to take a picture of a question. He looked from the photo to me, a slow, understanding smile spreading across his face. He reached out and put his hand over mine, his fingers warm on my skin. "I think you have your answer now," he said. And I knew he was right. The question had been answered. The space was no longer empty. Some structures, I've come to realize, are not built of steel and concrete, but of quieter, more fragile materials. They are built of shared breaths in the dark, of hands clasped together under a woolen blanket, of unspoken fears and whispered confessions. Julian and I built such a structure in the heart of a cold, lonely place that was designed to strip away individuality and forge men into a single, uniform unit. We found each other in the cracks of that rigid system. We built a sanctuary in a narrow bunk, a fortress against the world, and, eventually, a home for each other. We learned that the silence between two people can be a room, a door, or a weapon. And we learned that the most terrifying and beautiful thing in the world is to finally, honestly, speak. We began to heal in the beautiful, honest silence we had learned to create together.